Hello and welcome to Dewtime. My name is Isaiah and today we embark on a journey into the heart of our planet's most formidable and awe-inspiring phenomena. We live on a world of breathtaking beauty, a delicate balance of forces that sustain life. But within this intricate system, there are moments when the raw, untamed power of nature is unleashed with devastating consequences. These are the great atmospheric engines we call hurricanes, cyclones, or typhoons, vast, swirling vortices of wind and water born over warm tropical oceans. Their scale is almost beyond comprehension, their energy dwarfing anything humanity has ever created. Seen from space, they possess a mesmerizing, almost ethereal beauty, a spiral galaxy of cloud. Yet, on the ground, they can bring utter devastation. For centuries, coastal communities have lived under the shadow of these storms, learning to respect their power, yet often finding themselves helpless in their path. They are a stark reminder that we are but guests on this dynamic and ever-changing planet, subject to forces far greater than ourselves. Today, we will look back through history at the 10 deadliest of these storms ever recorded. This is not just a list of meteorological events, it is a chronicle of human tragedy, resilience, and the enduring struggle to understand and coexist with the immense power of our natural world. We will explore the stories behind the numbers, the communities shattered, and the lessons learned from the unrelenting fury of the wind and the waves. These are the stories of the deadliest hurricanes in history. Our journey begins in the 18th century, long before the advent of satellites or modern meteorology. In October of 1780, an immense and terrifying storm, known to history simply as the Great Hurricane, carved a path of unparalleled destruction across the Lesser Antilles. This was not merely a storm, it was an event of almost biblical proportions, an atmospheric anomaly so powerful that it defies easy comparison with modern hurricanes. It struck in the midst of the American Revolutionary War, and its victims were not just civilians, but the great naval fleets of Britain and France, who found their warships, the most advanced technology of the age, splintered like matchsticks. The storm's first major impact was on Barbados. Eyewitness accounts, painstaking letters written in the aftermath describe a scene of utter annihilation. They speak of winds so violent they stripped the very bark from the trees, leaving behind a desolate skeletal landscape. Buildings constructed of stone, fortresses designed to withstand cannon fire, were simply flattened, their foundations scoured from the earth. The wind didn't just blow, it seemed to possess a malevolent physical presence, a roaring monster that consumed everything in its path. The sound, they wrote, was a deafening, continuous scream that drove people to the brink of madness. From Barbados, the hurricane moved relentlessly onward, its eye passing over Martinique and St. Lucia. Here, the devastation was repeated with horrifying precision. On Martinique, a French convoy of over 40 ships carrying thousands of soldiers was caught at sea and utterly destroyed. Nearly every vessel was lost, dragged to the bottom of the churning ocean, taking with them the lives of all aboard. The port city of St. Pierre was obliterated, with reports claiming that not a single house was left standing. The sheer force of the storm surge and waves was unimaginable, rearranging coastlines and erasing entire settlements from the map. The human cost was staggering, a toll that remains difficult to comprehend even today. The estimated death toll for the Great Hurricane is placed at over 22,000 people, making it the single deadliest Atlantic hurricane on record. This number is almost certainly an undercount, as records from the time were incomplete, and many smaller communities were simply wiped from existence without a trace. The storm's impact was so profound that it may have influenced the course of the war, crippling the British Royal Navy in the region more effectively than any military engagement could have. The Great Hurricane of 1780 stands as a monument to the supreme power of nature. It occurred in an era when such events were often seen as acts of God, divine punishment for human folly. Without the language of science to explain wind speeds or barometric pressure, those who survived were left to grapple with a force that seemed supernatural, a terrifying expression of the planet's untamable spirit. It remains a benchmark, a chilling reminder of the absolute worst-case scenario when the ocean and the atmosphere combine in perfect, destructive harmony. We now move forward 2 centuries, to a time of advanced warning systems and satellite tracking. Yet, as Hurricane Mitch demonstrated in 1998, technology can only do so much in the face of nature's overwhelming force, especially when that force is water. Mitch was not primarily a story of wind, it was a story of rain. After reaching Category 5 intensity over the Caribbean Sea, the hurricane slowed to a crawl as it approached the coast of Central America, creating a meteorological catastrophe of the highest order. For days, it lingered, pulling immense volumes of moisture from the ocean and unleashing it upon the mountainous terrain of Honduras and Nicaragua. The result was a deluge of historic proportions. Rivers that were normally placid streams transformed into raging torrents, hundreds of times their normal size. They overflowed their banks, consuming entire towns and agricultural valleys, in a tide of brown, debris-filled water. The relentless torrential rainfall saturated the steep hillsides, which had been widely deforested for farming. The soil, stripped of its anchoring roots, could no longer hold. The mountains themselves seemed to dissolve, unleashing thousands of catastrophic mudslides and landslides that buried entire villages in an instant. In Honduras, the devastation was almost total. The capital, Tegucigalpa, was cut in half, as the Choluteca River swelled and swept away whole neighborhoods. Infrastructure collapsed nationwide. An estimated 70% of the country's roads and bridges were destroyed, isolating countless communities and hampering rescue efforts. The economic heart of the nation, its vast banana and coffee plantations, was washed away, setting the country's development back by decades. Survivors spoke of a constant, terrifying roar, the sound of the rain, the rivers, and the collapsing earth merging into one continuous sound of destruction. Nicaragua suffered a similarly grim fate. The most infamous tragedy occurred at the Casita volcano. The crater lake at its summit, filled to bursting by Mitch's endless rains, collapsed. A lahar, a volcanic mudflow, rushed down the mountainside, erasing the towns of El Porvenir and Rolando Rodriguez from the face of the earth. Over 2,000 people were buried alive in a matter of minutes, a stark and horrifying example of the storm's cascading effects. It was a multifaceted disaster, where the initial hurricane was only the trigger for a far deadlier geological event. Hurricane Mitch left behind a legacy of over 11,000 confirmed deaths, with thousands more listed as missing, presumed dead. The storm highlighted a terrible vulnerability, the intersection of extreme weather, poverty, and environmental degradation. It wasn't just a hurricane, it was a socio-economic disaster laid bare by the forces of nature. The slow, grinding, waterlogged destruction of Mitch served as a powerful lesson that a hurricane's deadliest weapon is not always its wind, but its rain. At the dawn of the 20th century, the city of Galveston, Texas, was a jewel of the Gulf Coast. A bustling port with a booming economy and a vibrant culture, it was known as the Wall Street of the Southwest. Its residents, brimming with fin de siècle optimism, believed their city was destined for greatness. They lived on a low-lying barrier island, a sliver of sand between the Gulf of Mexico and the mainland, with its highest point a mere 8 feet above sea level. On September 8, 1900, this geographic vulnerability would lead to the deadliest natural disaster in United States history. The U.S. Weather Bureau, in its infancy, had limited data and a flawed understanding of hurricane dynamics. Warnings were issued, but they were tragically inadequate, downplaying the storm's true strength and predicted path. Many residents, accustomed to lesser storms, chose to ignore the alerts, with some even gathering at the beaches to watch the spectacular waves. They had no conception of what was bearing down on them, a powerful Category 4 hurricane, aimed directly at their unprotected city. There was no seawall, no elevated defense, nothing to stand between Galveston and the sea. As the storm made landfall, the city was subjected to a multi-pronged assault. First came the wind, with sustained speeds estimated at over 130 miles per hour. It tore roofs from buildings, shattered windows, and turned loose debris into lethal projectiles. But the true killer was the storm surge. A colossal wall of water, estimated to be over 15 feet high, surged over the island. It lifted entire houses from their foundations, smashing them into one another like toys. The city was completely inundated, submerged under a violent churning sea that swept inland for miles. The scenes of horror were indescribable. Thousands were trapped in their collapsing homes, drowned by the rising waters. Survivors clung to floating debris in the raging torrent, witnessing the complete destruction of their world. A 3-mile-long, 30-foot-high wall of wreckage, a grotesque mixture of lumber, furniture, and the bodies of people and animals, was pushed through the city by the surge, acting as a battering ram that obliterated anything still standing in its path. When the waters finally receded, they left behind a landscape of apocalyptic silence and ruin. The final death toll is uncertain, but it is estimated to be between 8,000 and 12,000 people. In a city of just 37,000, the loss was incomprehensible. The Galveston hurricane was a brutal lesson in humility and engineering. In its aftermath, the survivors undertook a monumental task. They raised the entire level of the city, in some places by as much as 17 feet, and constructed a massive seawall to protect it from the Gulf. The Great Storm of 1900 forever changed the course of Galveston's history, and served as a catalyst for the modernization of hurricane forecasting and coastal defense in America. In September 2017, just 2 weeks after being brushed by the powerful Hurricane Irma, the island of Puerto Rico faced a direct and catastrophic blow from Hurricane Maria. Maria was a storm of ferocious intensity, making landfall as a high-end Category 4 hurricane with sustained winds of 155 miles per hour. It was the strongest storm to strike the island in over 80 years, and its impact would plunge 3.4 million American citizens into a prolonged humanitarian crisis, the scale of which was not immediately understood. The storm's passage across the island was an act of systematic destruction. The relentless winds which lashed the island for hours, shredded homes, defoliated the lush landscape and crippled essential infrastructure. The island's Doppler weather radar, a crucial tool for meteorological observation, was destroyed. But the most devastating blow was to the electrical grid. The system, already fragile and poorly maintained, collapsed completely, plunging the entire island into darkness. This was not a temporary blackout. It was the beginning of the longest and largest power outage in modern U.S. history. The loss of power triggered a cascade of secondary disasters. Without electricity, water treatment plants failed, leaving much of the population without access to safe drinking water. Hospitals were forced to rely on failing backup generators, putting the lives of their most vulnerable patients at risk. Communication systems were obliterated, cell towers were toppled, and fiber optic cables were severed, cutting off the island from the outside world and isolating communities from each other. For days and weeks, many parts of Puerto Rico were completely unreachable, their fate unknown. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of chaos and desperation. Roads were blocked by landslides and debris, making it nearly impossible for aid to reach remote mountain communities. People waited in lines for hours, sometimes days, for basic necessities like fuel, food, and water. The official death toll, initially reported as just 64, was met with widespread disbelief by those on the ground who were witnessing the true scale of the tragedy. The lack of power, clean water, and medical care was leading to a slow, creeping death toll that was not being counted. It took nearly a year for independent researchers to determine the storm's true human cost. A study commissioned by the government of Puerto Rico and conducted by George Washington University estimated that 2,975 excess deaths occurred in the 6 months following the hurricane. This figure, which was eventually adopted as the official toll, reflects the grim reality that the majority of Maria's victims did not die in the storm itself, but in its long, dark aftermath. Hurricane Maria became a painful lesson in the fragility of modern infrastructure and the deadly consequences when vital systems fail. In late August 2005, Hurricane Katrina churned across the Gulf of Mexico, a monstrous Category 5 storm that seemed destined for the city of New Orleans. While it weakened slightly to a Category 3 before making landfall, its immense size drove a catastrophic storm surge directly towards the Louisiana and Mississippi coasts. For New Orleans, a city famously situated below sea level, the danger was not just from the storm itself, but from the complex system of levees and floodwalls designed to protect it. It was a system that was about to fail on a catastrophic scale. The storm's surge overwhelmed the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, a man-made shipping channel that acted as a funnel, amplifying the water's height and force. This surge placed an unbearable strain on the city's flood defenses. The levees did not just overtop. In multiple locations, they breached. The floodwalls collapsed. This was the moment the natural disaster became a man-made catastrophe. Water from Lake Pontchartrain and the industrial canals poured into the city, not as a gradual rise but as a violent, destructive flood. The flooding was rapid and devastating. Entire neighborhoods in the lower Ninth Ward and other low-lying areas were submerged in minutes, with water reaching the rooftops of single-story homes. Tens of thousands of residents who had been unable or unwilling to evacuate were trapped. They scrambled into attics and onto roofs, desperately hoping for rescue as the toxic floodwaters swirled below them. The scenes broadcast to a horrified world were shocking. American citizens, stranded on their own rooftops, waving for help in one of the nation's most historic cities. The aftermath was a portrait of societal breakdown. The Louisiana Superdome, intended as a shelter of last resort, became a symbol of the chaos, housing thousands in squalid conditions without adequate food, water, or sanitation. The response from local, state, and federal agencies was slow and widely criticized as inadequate and disorganized, leaving the city's most vulnerable residents to fend for themselves for days. The disaster exposed deep-seated issues of racial and economic inequality, as the poorest, predominantly African-American neighborhoods suffered the most profound losses. Hurricane Katrina was responsible for over 1,800 deaths, and caused more than $125 billion in damages, making it the costliest hurricane in U.S. history. It was a searing indictment of failed engineering, poor planning, and institutional neglect. The storm itself was a product of nature, but the flooding of New Orleans was a failure of foresight and responsibility. Katrina left an indelible scar on the American psyche, a powerful and tragic reminder that our greatest vulnerabilities often lie in the systems we build to protect ourselves. In November 2013, the world watched in awe and horror as a storm of almost unprecedented power formed in the Western Pacific. Known internationally as Typhoon Haiyan, and in the Philippines as Yolanda, it was one of the most intense tropical cyclones ever to make landfall. With sustained winds estimated at a staggering 195 miles per hour, it was a storm at the absolute limit of what is meteorologically possible. Its target was the central Philippines, an archipelago of islands and coastal communities lying directly in its path. While the extreme winds were terrifying, Haiyan's most destructive weapon was its storm surge. As the super typhoon funneled into the shallow V-shaped San Pedro Bay, it pushed a monstrous wall of seawater ahead of it. In the city of Tacloban, the surge reached heights of over 20 feet, behaving more like a tsunami than a traditional storm surge. It swept inland with incredible speed and force, obliterating everything in its path. Entire coastal neighborhoods known as barangays were simply erased from existence. The devastation was absolute. Structures that were not made of reinforced concrete were completely destroyed. The surge was so powerful it tossed large ships inland, leaving them grounded amidst the ruins of what were once homes and businesses. The city's airport was destroyed, hampering the initial relief efforts. For those who survived the initial onslaught, the landscape was unrecognizable. A vast wasteland of debris, mud, and, sadly, the dead. The sheer velocity of the water meant that seeking shelter in many designated evacuation centers was futile, as the buildings themselves were inundated or destroyed. The human toll was immense. The official death toll for Typhoon Haiyan is over 6,300 people, with more than 1,000 still listed as missing. Millions were left homeless, their livelihoods destroyed. The scale of the disaster overwhelmed local resources, prompting a massive international relief effort. Aid from countries around the world poured into the Philippines, but the logistical challenges of reaching remote, devastated islands were immense. The relief operation was one of the largest in modern history, a global response to a storm of global significance. Typhoon Haiyan served as a terrifying preview of a potential future in a warming world. Scientists debated the role of climate change in its formation, but its sheer intensity highlighted the extreme vulnerability of low-lying coastal populations to superstorms. The tragedy of Tacloban, where a city was virtually wiped off the map by a wall of water, became a powerful symbol in the global conversation about climate adaptation, resilience, and the urgent need to protect the world's most exposed communities from the growing power of the sea. The 2004 Atlantic hurricane season was relentlessly active, but one storm, Hurricane Jeanne, would leave a particularly devastating legacy, not because of its wind, but because of its water and a tragically vulnerable landscape. After meandering through the Caribbean, Jeanne made a final fatal pass over the island of Hispaniola, shared by the Dominican Republic and Haiti. It was in Haiti, particularly in the coastal city of Gonaives, that the storm unleashed a catastrophe. The hurricane was a relatively weak Category 1 at the time, but its slow movement produced unimaginable rainfall. The core of the tragedy in Haiti lies in its environment. Centuries of deforestation have left the nation's mountainous terrain almost completely bare. Trees, whose roots once acted as a natural sponge, holding soil and water in place, were largely gone, cut down for charcoal and timber. When Jean's torrential rains fell upon these denuded hillsides, there was nothing to stop the water. It cascaded downwards, gathering mud, rocks and debris, transforming into thick, powerful mud flows that descended upon the communities below. Gonaives, Haiti's third-largest city, is situated on a coastal plain at the base of these barren mountains. It was directly in the path of the ensuing floods and mudslides. A deluge of brown, suffocating mud swept through the city, burying homes up to their rooftops. People were caught completely by surprise, with many drowned in their sleep. The city was turned into a massive muddy lake, its streets impassable, its buildings inundated. The scene was one of utter despair, as survivors waded through the foul water, searching for loved ones and awaiting help that was slow to arrive. The aftermath was a public health emergency. The floodwaters, contaminated with sewage and decaying matter, created a breeding ground for disease. The lack of clean water and sanitation facilities led to outbreaks of cholera and other waterborne illnesses, compounding the initial tragedy. The international community responded with aid, but the challenges of operating in a city buried in mud, with its infrastructure completely destroyed, were immense. The disaster highlighted the concept of a man-enhanced natural disaster, where human actions had created the conditions for catastrophe. Hurricane Jeanne was responsible for over 3,000 deaths in Haiti alone. It was a horrifying testament to the deadly link between poverty, environmental degradation, and vulnerability to natural hazards. The storm itself was not exceptionally strong, but it struck a place that had been stripped of its natural defenses. The tragedy of Gonaives serves as a stark warning that the deadliest storms are not always the most powerful, but those that strike the most vulnerable places on Earth. In the autumn of 1963, a colossal and slow-moving storm named Hurricane Flora brought unprecedented destruction to the Caribbean. Flora was a monster of a hurricane, reaching Category 4 strength and maintaining its power for an unusually long time. Its path was erratic, but its most devastating impact was felt on the islands of Tobago, Cuba, and Hispaniola. The storm's defining characteristic was its sluggish pace. It lingered for days, relentlessly battering the islands with punishing winds and, most critically, biblical amounts of rainfall. Flora first struck the small island of Tobago with unexpected ferocity, causing immense damage and killing dozens. From there, it moved westward, its sights set on the larger islands of the Greater Antilles. Its most prolonged and deadly assault was on the island of Cuba. For 4 agonizing days, the hurricane stalled over the island's eastern provinces. It was a meteorological siege, dumping incredible quantities of rain. Over 100 inches were recorded in some mountainous areas, a figure that remains one of the highest ever documented for a tropical cyclone. The result of this endless deluge was catastrophic flooding. Rivers across eastern Cuba swelled to unimaginable levels, bursting their banks and inundating vast swaths of agricultural land. Entire towns were submerged, and the infrastructure of the region was completely destroyed. The Cuban government under Fidel Castro mounted a massive state-directed rescue and recovery effort, but the scale of the disaster was overwhelming. Thousands were stranded by the floodwaters, and the nation's vital sugar and coffee crops were wiped out. After its devastating tenure over Cuba, the weakened but still moisture-laden storm drifted over Haiti. Here, as with Hurricane Jeanne decades later, the combination of extreme rainfall and a deforested landscape proved lethal. Flash floods and mudslides cascaded down the mountains, sweeping away entire communities. The death toll in Haiti was enormous, with estimates suggesting that thousands perished in the torrents of mud and water. The lack of robust infrastructure and warning systems left the rural population tragically exposed. Hurricane Flora is credited with causing an estimated 7,000 to 8,000 deaths across the Caribbean, making it one of the deadliest Atlantic hurricanes of the 20th century. Its legacy is one of slow, grinding destruction. It was not a storm that delivered a single quick blow, but a persistent, lingering killer that drowned landscapes and communities under the sheer weight of its water. Flora was a stark demonstration that a hurricane's speed, or lack thereof, can be just as deadly as the speed of its winds. In late October 2012, an unusual and monstrous storm began to take shape. Hurricane Sandy was not a typical hurricane. As it moved northward from the Caribbean, it began to merge with a winter storm system moving in from the west, creating a massive and complex superstorm. This hybrid nature gave Sandy an enormous size. At its peak, its tropical storm-force winds spanned over 1,000 miles in diameter. While it was only a Category 1 hurricane at its U.S. landfall, its immense scale and unorthodox track would bring unprecedented devastation to the most densely populated corridor in the United States. Before reaching the U.S., Sandy carved a deadly path through the Caribbean, killing over 70 people in Haiti, Cuba, and the Bahamas. But its most infamous impact was yet to come. The storm took a bizarre and rare sharp left turn, heading directly for the coast of New Jersey and New York. This trajectory, perpendicular to the coastline, maximized the potential for a devastating storm surge, which was further amplified by a full moon, creating a higher-than-normal astronomical high tide. It was a perfect storm of compounding factors. The impact on the Jersey Shore and New York City was historic. A record-breaking storm surge, over 14 feet in some areas, inundated coastal communities. In New Jersey, iconic boardwalks were ripped apart, and entire neighborhoods were washed away. In New York, the sea poured into Lower Manhattan, flooding the subway system, road tunnels, and the electrical infrastructure that powers Wall Street. The images were surreal: yellow cabs submerged in seawater, a darkened skyline in one of the world's brightest cities, and homes in Staten Island and Queens reduced to splinters. The storm's reach was vast, causing power outages for over 8 million people across 21 states from the Carolinas to Maine and as far west as Michigan. The economic damage was immense, totaling over $70 billion, making it, at the time, the second costliest hurricane in U.S. history after Katrina. The total death toll from Sandy was over 230 people, with nearly 160 of those fatalities occurring in the United States, Canada, and the Caribbean. Hurricane Sandy was a wake-up call. Its hybrid nature and unusual track raised urgent questions about the influence of a warming Arctic and changing jet stream patterns on weather systems. It demonstrated that even a technically weaker hurricane in terms of wind speed could cause catastrophic damage through its size and storm surge, especially when it strikes a highly developed and vulnerable coastline. The superstorm forced cities like New York to fundamentally rethink their relationship with the sea and invest billions in coastal resilience for an uncertain future. The 2017 Atlantic hurricane season is remembered for its relentless succession of powerful storms, and at the forefront of this parade was Hurricane Irma. For a staggering 37 hours, Irma maintained wind speeds of 185 miles per hour, the longest any cyclone on record anywhere on the globe has maintained that intensity. It was a true behemoth, a perfectly formed buzzsaw of a storm that tracked across the Atlantic, leaving a trail of catastrophic damage across the islands of the northeastern Caribbean before turning its sights on Florida. Irma's first and most devastating impacts were on the small islands of the Leeward Islands. It made landfall on Barbuda as a Category 5 storm, rendering the island, in the words of its prime minister, barely habitable. An estimated 95% of the island's structures were damaged or destroyed. From there, Irma continued its rampage, striking St. Martin, Anguilla, and the British and U.S. Virgin Islands with the full force of its eye wall. These islands, jewels of the Caribbean, were stripped bare, their lush vegetation gone, their infrastructure shattered, and their economies, heavily reliant on tourism, left in ruins. The storm's power was awe-inspiring and terrifying. The sheer force of the wind was enough to register on seismographs designed to detect earthquakes. As Irma passed, its immense low pressure and powerful offshore winds produced a bizarre phenomenon. It literally sucked the water away from the shorelines in the Bahamas and on the Florida coast, leaving behind an empty, muddy seabed for hundreds of yards before the water came rushing back. This negative storm surge was a stark visual representation of the storm's incredible atmospheric power. After grazing Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, Irma made a turn towards Florida, prompting one of the largest evacuations in U.S. history. It made landfall in the Florida Keys as a Category 4 storm, devastating communities like Big Pine Key and Cudjoe Key, before making a second landfall on the state's southwest coast. While it had weakened, its enormous wind field caused widespread damage and power outages across the entire Florida peninsula, from Miami to Jacksonville. The storm's sheer size meant that virtually no part of the state was left untouched. In total, Hurricane Irma was responsible for at least 134 deaths, and caused over $77 billion in damages, making it one of the costliest storms on record. It was a testament to the raw power a hurricane can achieve over warm Atlantic waters. For the islands of the northeastern Caribbean, the recovery from Irma has been a long and arduous process. The storm was a brutal reminder of their extreme vulnerability, and a powerful example of the destructive potential of a perfectly formed, long-lived and historically intense Atlantic hurricane. We have journeyed through tales of immense power and profound loss. From the unimaginable winds of 1780 to the engineered flood of New Orleans and the tsunami-like surge in the Philippines, the story of these great storms is a powerful chapter in the history of our planet. They are not malevolent entities but simply the workings of a complex atmospheric system, a system that transfers heat from the tropics to the poles, a vital part of the mechanism that makes our world habitable. They are, in their own way, a part of the Earth's heartbeat. Yet to stand in their path is to experience a force that is utterly indifferent to human life and endeavor. These events strip away the veneer of our control, reminding us that our sprawling cities and sophisticated technologies are fragile when faced with the full might of the natural world. The stories of these hurricanes are ultimately human stories, of terror and tragedy, but also of extraordinary resilience, of communities rebuilding from ruin, and of the enduring human spirit that refuses to be extinguished, even in the darkest of times. As our climate continues to change and the oceans continue to warm, the science tells us that the potential for storms of such devastating intensity may increase. Our challenge, then, is to listen to these stories from the past, to learn the lessons written in the wind and the water. We must build with more foresight, live with more respect for the natural forces that shape our world, and foster the global cooperation needed to protect the most vulnerable among us. For in the end, our survival on this beautiful, turbulent planet depends not on conquering nature, but on understanding our place within it.